Hello, it's Coach Robert again with an advanced endgame lesson. This time we're going to be looking at opposite color bishop endgames, and we're going to just go through one example that demonstrates 6 principles of how you navigate these kinds of positions, both from the attacking side and the defending side. I got this example and the interest to look at these principles from Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual. It was one of the first chess books that I read several years ago, and while it's a very advanced and really large, basically just textbook on chess, it contains a huge number of really informative positions, so I really encourage people to use it as a reference, not necessarily to read it from front to back. And this is also sort of a taste of what we're going to be talking about when I do a live stream in the near future about opposite color bishop endgames in a more concrete way. So let's talk about these principles by exploring an example. In this position, well, you might want to pause here and just think about whether white's better, black's better, or it's a draw, and just try to soak in what you think might happen based on your intuition. I like to get an idea of what's going on in the position before I check anyone's analysis, just so that it's more of a learning opportunity. At a glance, it looks like black is winning because black has more material, and it's pretty clear that there are a bunch of ways that black could create, maintain, and eventually promote a pass pawn on the king side because they have 4 against 1. That's a huge majority in most situations. Meanwhile, white only has 2 pawns, and the pawn on c4, you might even imagine it getting captured and just being completely useless to white. So clearly white is playing for a draw. They don't have really any winning resources here. It's super unlikely that they could ever break through with the c pawn or the h pawn. So we're looking for some kind of way to salvage the position as white, and black is trying to win. So the first thing you need to know, and the first principle of the opposite color bishop endgame, is that this is one of the most drawish endgames in chess. No matter like how many pawns you have or whatever, if there's opposite color bishops and there's no rooks, knights, queens, whatever, it's very, very likely to end in a draw with best play. And the reason for that in general is that these 2 bishops can't interact with each other in a direct way. So one of the main resources in the endgame, trading off pieces to reach a winning king and pawn endgame, is not possible here except by some kind of devious tactical means, which are not generally available, hence the high draw rate. So white is going to be stronger on the light squares always, and black is going to be stronger on the dark squares always in this particular example. Whether that's enough to win or draw remains to be seen. So the first principle, even if you are down 2 to 3 pawns, you can often draw these positions because of the fact that it's opposite color bishops. Same color bishops, not the case. They could trade for each other. They can fight for control of a key square that's on the same color, but if they're opposite, no way. So here, even though white is down, there's a lot of hope. So you shouldn't ever resign these opposite color bishop endgames. You should play it out and see what happens. The next thing that you need to know is that because the bishops control opposite halves of the board, right, all the dark squares for this bishop, all the light squares for this bishop, the position of the pieces is more important than material. So even if you have just a few pawns left and you are struggling to survive, you shouldn't necessarily hold on to the pawns for dear life. You should look for opportunities to give them up in order to get a draw of some kind. And similarly, if you're on the attacking side, you might look for a way that you can sacrifice those 2 to 3 extra pawns in order to create one strong pass pawn that can't be stopped by the opposing bishop. So one of the major ways that you draw here, and this is another principle, is by creating a fortress. Fortresses are rather difficult to understand. I'm going to be doing a live stream at some point about fortresses, not just of this kind, but all fortresses in the endgame. But the general notion is that you try to set up a position that you can maintain forever, where your opponent cannot make any progress. So in this case, we would like to prevent the promotion of any of black's pawns without necessarily winning the pawns. We just want to block them and make it impossible for black to take over the squares that lead to their promotion. So that's a principle. We're trying to form a fortress. And when you identify a fortress, you have to imagine it ahead of time. You're going to say, like, okay, if I can make them play this, if I can get my piece here, is there any way for them to break through? If the answer is no, that's a fortress. And then you're going to try to back solve in order to find the path that leads to that fortress. So instead of just calculating forced lines here, we're imagining a position that could be a draw and then aiming for that. And for the attacking side, they want to prevent the formation of these fortresses. Okay, so let's actually get into what we should play here. So first we can do that by imagining a fortress. So you might want to pause here and see if you can imagine how white could possibly change the arrangement of these pieces in order to hang on. One thing that I would like to do is win this pawn on e6. If I could somehow win that pawn, or otherwise get it to leave the e6 square, that'd be really great, because I think that black's winning plan involves maybe putting a bishop on c7 to control all the dark squares, and then advancing on the light squares, probably with help from the king. So black wants to bring their king towards the center, control these dark squares, play f5 and g4. But if the pawn is not on e6, they can't play f5 without either allowing white to sacrifice their bishop to get rid of all the pawns, could happen, or allowing the king to take the pawn on g5, which means they could never play g4. So we also want to get active with our king. That's another thing we might want to do. So I'm imagining a fortress position where maybe my king is on g4, preventing f5 from ever happening, and somehow I've gotten rid of this pawn on e6. So those are some things that come to my mind. So this informs my calculation and also brings us to another principle. If we sacrifice this pawn, this goes with the idea that material is not that important in these positions. We already talked about that. Now if I play bishop b3, they have to play e5 or else lose the pawn. And now here's our next principle, that we want to keep our bishop on a diagonal where it can both attack and defend. This is called the one diagonal principle in Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual. So if we play bishop e6, you can see that this bishop is optimally placed. None of these pawns can advance without being taken by the bishop. And so we are defending at the same time as we are preparing to keep our king active. So this one diagonal is the only one that's important. If there were two diagonals that were important, like for example if there was a black pawn on like a3, this wouldn't really be working. There's a technique called the pants, at least it's called the pants technique in Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual, and that's one where you will like push one pawn to deflect the bishop and then promote the other pawn. And we'll talk about that in a future live stream. That's not really a principle so much as a tactical thing, but the principle of one diagonal is aimed at avoiding situations where you have to guard both sides of the board. We don't want that. We want to guard just one side of the board and have that be good enough. Okay, now another thing that is sort of wrapped into this maneuver where we sacrifice one pawn in order to force all the pawns on one color is yet another principle, that the stronger side should keep their pawns on the opposite color and the weaker side should keep their pawns on the same color. So in this case, black would want their bishops on light squares so that their bishop has more activity, and our side would want to keep the pawns on the light squares. So just as a thought experiment to try to bring this home, if all the pawns are on dark in this example, like you see here, that means that you don't have the necessary resources on the light squares to make advances onto the next diagonal, because we need to sort of control each diagonal as we go to get these pawns rolling. So we would have only the king to control the light squares. If we had some pawns safe on the light squares, we would be able to break through much more easily. But with all the pawns on dark, not only is this bishop blocked, but it's easy for the enemy bishop to get in front of these pawns and stop them from advancing. So it kind of goes together with the one diagonal principle. Alright, now once we've gotten bishop e6, this is basically a done deal. So let's say black plays king c7. The next thing that we should do is round this out by fully forming a fortress. We should put our king on either g4 or e4, you have to decide. So maybe you could pause here and decide which one is more active and prevents black's opportunities from playing for a win. I think this e-pawn is still pretty strong, and so for that reason I would like to stay over here to prevent the black king from coming around and maybe supporting the advance of the e-pawn. That would lead to our bishop getting split and one of these pawns promoting eventually. So there's one more thing. There's another principle called pawn in the crosshairs. So there was a lot going on with the move c5 and then bishop b3. The principle of pawn in the crosshairs means that a typical way of defending in the opposite color bishop endgame is by attacking the pawns that are on your bishop's color to force them to advance. So we've done several things at the same time here. We're forcing e5, so that's called pawn in the crosshairs. And all these things you can review in Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual, if you care to. And just from the beginning, so the first principle that we saw active here when we play c5 is acknowledging that material is not that important. Even if you're several pawns down, you can draw. So you have to be open to the idea of sacrificing pawns to gain access to important squares. And that comes to the next principle, that position is more important than material. So these two things are at work together when we play c5, that we're trying to get our pieces onto better squares. We don't necessarily care about how much we have. Now when we play bishop b3, this is a combination of the pawn in the crosshairs concept, where we are attacking the pawn, which would either force them to defend it or advance. In this case, they can only advance. They don't have any way to defend the pawn. And this also combines with the principle that we should place our pawns on the same color as our bishop when we defend, and on the opposite color when we attack. So we forced black to do something that is not beneficial for them. The pawns are on the wrong color now. And then the next thing is to use the one diagonal principle, so that we can successfully guard against several threats at the same time. And this also goes together with the notion that the way that we usually draw in worse positions is by forming a fortress. You can play this position out against your friend or a computer and really figure out how there's no way that black can make progress here, even though they are up 3 pawns. So I hope you like this, and you guys can look forward to a live stream about opposite colored bishops coming up in the near future. Until next time, take care and good luck in your endgames.